Good evening. My name is Margery Gans, and I am a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. And I'm delighted that you could join us this evening for our June, sorry, right month, June interview in our virtual series of the Writers' Room After Dark. The series began in 2022, and as you can see, we have two people tonight, and in a minute I will come back and introduce them. But first, just to let you know, for anybody who's new to the Writers' Room, it's a co-working space in downtown Boston, and we welcome any and all writers, whether you're established or you're just starting, if you want or need a quiet place to write. Because the room is open 24 hours a day, it provides desks and silence and just the quiet companionship of other writers. We've been serving the writers of the greater Boston area since about 1993. And then during and since the pandemic, when people weren't able to come to the room, we've been offering online resources, including a reading series where two authors come and read their works once a month, an online writing group with prompts and discussions, and this series where we interview people. The interview series has guests which are knowledgeable, not just about writing, but also about getting work to a publisher, finding agents, working with agents, and guidance for online publishing. So far, we've interviewed authors, experts in audiobooks for writers who want to get their work on that format. And we continue to seek a wide range of people whose expertise we can tap. So please contact us if you're curious or you have any questions about the room and its programs. You can check out our Facebook and Instagram posts at Writers of Boston. The website has photos, announcements, and that's where you can find recordings of the past readings and also the past interviews. We would love to have new members, and we have different levels of membership. So there's weekend and there's full-time. So if you're interested, please check out the website, writersroomofboston.org. Also need to say, because it's important, this series is made possible by grants from the Mass Cultural Council and the Boston Cultural Council, and we also rely on friends. So if you enjoy this program, please consider making a contribution using the donate button on the website. And we will be recording this interview and a replay will be available on the website. Tonight we have Marc Eichen and Jennifer Jean, and they are going to talk about translation. So if you have a question, I'm going to introduce each of them, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat section at the bottom of your screen. I'll check there to make sure we get them. Jennifer Jean's poetry collections include Vase, Object Lesson, and The Fool. Her resource book is Object Lesson, a guide to writing poetry. Her bilingual poetry collection, Where Do You Live?, which is translated into Arabic, which I do not speak, forthcoming from the Arrowsmith Press in 2025, was co-written and co-translated with Iraqi poet Dr. Hana Ahmed. As well, she has edited Other Paths for Shahrazad, a bilingual anthology of poetry by Arab women, forthcoming from Tupelo Press in 2025. Her poetry and prose and co-translations appear in Poetry Magazine, Rattle Magazine, The Common, the Los Angeles Review, Terrain, and On the Seawall. She's received honors, residencies, and fellowships from the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop, the Academy of American Poets, the Mass Cultural Council, Disquiet, and the Women's Federation for World Peace. Jennifer is an organizer for the artist collective Her Story Is, a core faculty member at Solstice MFA, and the senior program manager of 24 Pearl Street, the Fine Arts Work Center's online writing poetry program in Provincetown. And Marc. Marc has a PhD from the Graduate School of Geography, Clark University. From 2015 to 2019, he was a visiting faculty member at the State University of Zanzibar. His fiction focuses on life in Zanzibar and the global South and in urban and red state America. He has had stories published in Still Points Arts Quarterly, The Good Life Review, the Chautauqua Journal, and West Trade Review, and reprinted in Toyon. He has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and the Best of the Web is winner of the Richard Cortez Day Prize in Fiction. Current projects include a book of short stories, Wind, Sand, Sky, published in both Swahili and English. And Mark, I'm going to leave you to pronounce that if you want to.
Yeah, okay, so it's Wind, Sand, Sky, and it's Upepo Mchanga Anga. That's
Okay.
Wind, Sand, Sky in Swahili.
Okay. And it's distributed by Amazon and the African Books Collective, a mystery set in Zanzibar and a novel of loss and renewal set in Sandpoint, Idaho. He is represented by Kristen Che at Blue Hen. So I just want to say a little bit because I really wanted to do this interview about translations. I am not a translator. I am trying to learn a language, and in doing so have become much more aware of how tricky it is to get the essence of any language into another language. I've also discovered that when I was teaching ESL and trying to explain English to a Chinese speaker, it's not simple. And so I am fascinated. I want to hear from each of you. And I'm wondering if each of you could start by just saying a little bit about your translation self and how you got into it, your languages. And yeah, Jen, you want to go first?
Yes, sure. Thank you for having me here, Margery. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about translation, which has fascinated me for my whole adult life, reading works in translation. In 2017, I became involved with a group called Her Story Is, which you mentioned in my biography. And it's a collective of women artists from the US and from primarily Iraq, but also increasingly from other Arab nations. And the purpose of the collective is to have Americans or Westerners work with Arab women on projects and collaborate and help promote their work, and also offer our work up for translation into Arabic. And so once I began working with that group, I became close to one of the poets, Hannah Ahmed, also mentioned in my bio. She's a wonderful prize-winning poet living in Mosul, and she's been through a lot in the war time. She always tells me, you know, I was born in war, I live in war. And my life has also been affected by war. My father was a Vietnam War veteran, and he was severely affected. I did not grow up with him because he just degenerated psychologically. And so I just felt my life was also affected by war. So we decided to do a project together, which is going to culminate in publication next year, called Where Do You Live? And we are exchanging poems in our own languages. So she doesn't speak English and I don't speak Arabic. But what we do is we work with a third person who speaks both languages, and we co-translate in a co-translation team each other's work. So she'll write a poem and give it to our co-translator, Wadak Quays, also an Iraqi. She's not a poet. I don't think she's getting her degree in translation. And then Wadak and I will work on the translation of the poem so that I can understand what Hannah is trying to communicate with me or ask me or tell me. And then I respond with my poem, and then they too work out on my poem. And so that's a beautiful project. I feel I'm really happy to be part of this. We're wrapping it up, and as I said, it'll be out next year. And other than that, I've organized through this group, Her Story Is, the anthology, working with none of my own work, just poetry from 22 Arab nations, just written by women, all contemporary, all currently living, which is rare for that kind of anthology to be published. But I'm happy to be leading that project, and that will be out from Tupelo at the end of next year. So that's my experience. And as I said, I'm monolingual. And the last thing I'll mention is something I said to two of you earlier. I realized that it would be really nice if I could just translate on my own. So I plunged into learning Korean. And the reason why I chose Korean is because it's the only nation I've been to. Well, no, it's the nation I've been to the most. So I've traveled, but I've been there 5 times, I believe. So I just thought, okay, I'm used to the language, and it wasn't so it didn't seem so difficult to me at first. But I'm a long way off from being a fluent speaker or being able to translate at this point.
So I realize I'm going to ask each of you, you can do it now or you can wait till after Mark speaks, but how you got to the languages you got to. I mean, Arabic and Swahili are not the first languages anybody would think of in terms of translating, and that's partly why I love having the two of you. So, you talk about your father having been a Vietnam vet, and it's interesting, my father was a World War II vet with not quite the damage, but I don't think it helped him any. And, so how did you make your way to doing this with people who speak Arabic?
Well, I saw it as the group Her Story is a peace building project.
Huh?
And so I saw it as a way, as an artist, I can combat war, in my own small way, and the effects of war by working with people who have been through conflict currently.
Yeah.
Not me. It's sort of like it's an inherited situation. Not great, but definitely not the same as, let's say, Hana. And so that's more, I mean, it could have been Vietnam. I've worked with the William Joyner Institute, which is out of UMass Boston, and they have done a lot of work with Vietnam War veterans and bringing Americans together with Vietnamese. I'm totally inspired by the translator Martha Collins, who's translated Vietnamese poetry. But so it could have gone in that direction, but I just fell in with this wonderful group, and it's also the Iraq War is more contemporary to me than, let's say, the Vietnam War.
Sure.
So it felt right.
Yep. Makes sense. Yeah. Mark.
Yeah, I took Spanish in high school and was a terrible, I would say, Spanish student. I think that's because I didn't really know the parts of speech in English, so trying to teach me about verbs and the verb tenses was kind of a hopeless exercise. I managed to graduate from high school, and then I tried in college. I took French 1, and what I found out was that the people who take French 1 in college, especially as freshmen, they're the people who've already had 3 years of French in high school. And so they're there to, sort of get an easy A. And for me, I was there to not flunk out of college. And it was close. I mean, to be quite honest, it was just a hard and kind of bad, terrible exercise and frustration. And however, I did discover when I lived in Egypt for a year that I loved speaking Arabic on the street in the most rudimentary way. And I loved that people would correct me, they would laugh at me, they would, sort of make fun of me. I would struggle along, and, I would do the best I could, which wasn't very good, but it was great fun. And then when I stopped working formally, I told my wife that I wanted to go back to teaching natural resource management. And then I said, and I want to do it in East Africa. And she said, well, best of luck. How are you going to do that? And it turns out that BU has an excellent language program that's connected with the African Studies Center. And so I began taking Swahili there. I went to Zanzibar, which is the cultural and linguistic home of Swahili, and took Swahili there. One thing led to another. The geographers at the State University of Zanzibar encouraged me to stick around. And so I went back and forth for 5 years, and my Swahili got better and better, and then it got worse and worse after I stopped speaking it. So, but I love speaking Swahili, and it always makes me enormously happy to do it. Enormously happy. And so when I had an opportunity to have a book published in East Africa by Nkuki Naniota, which is the publisher of record and the best publisher in East Africa, I said, oh, and by the way, we're going to publish this in Swahili as well as English, since I have had it translated. And they said, really? Are we? And so it was a little ironic that I was speaking to my editor, Adam Kukinaniota, and trying to convince her, a native Swahili speaker, to publish the book in Swahili in a country whose one of the official languages is Swahili. And the irony wasn't lost on either of us. But we did do that, and it's been quite well received, both in English and Swahili, and so it makes me very happy that I was able to do that. Very happy indeed. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So excuse me, this is Julie. She will join us occasionally. So I was going to pick up on the conversation that we were having before that I know each of you have thoughts about, and then we will let the conversation go. But you were talking both before just now and also a little bit on email about translating, sort of who does the translation and where does AI fit? And it's interesting. I will add that I've been reading a book, listening to a book written about Oliver Sacks, who is an odd duck, but talks about AI and translating, in fact, and about what he thought got lost in terms of a sort of soul. But he was also not a big fan of technology necessarily. So I wanted to hear the two of you sort of talk about where you think that fits in this modern time.
Jennifer, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. My thoughts that are that currently the AI in terms of translation isn't up to par with translating artistic works. That it's useful for information, it's useful for churning out, maybe it's something that, anyways, I just said it, that's for producing things that are useful for just getting the information. But as for art, it's something different. And this comes out of a conversation that I had with the translation teams I've worked with. And they're all the people I've worked with have always said, like, I'm so grateful that you're here, Jennifer. And I would say, why? I don't speak Arabic. And they would say, because you understand poetry in English. You understand the nuances. You understand, and through conversation, there are parts in poems that if they're just directly translated, just don't make any sense at all. And you can see this if you go on, let's say, Facebook. And I'm on Facebook with my Arab friends, and I see the translations that Facebook does, and it's like garbled. It's nonsense. It doesn't translate. Even sometimes when they're not speaking in metaphor, but especially if they're speaking in metaphor, it doesn't capture what a contemporary English reader would understand. And a lot of that understanding comes through the conversation. I think an individual can do it too. It doesn't have to be a team. So I'm not speaking about that, but I'm saying that I don't think at this point AI is there. Of course, technology could jump really fast and could get there. However, I think in that case, there would still be a niche that would be reserved in the realm of art for translations produced by humans. Already, art it's its own niche area. Not every human is into art. Not every human is into poetry. That's for sure, and definitely not into translated poetry. That's an even more. You get smaller and smaller and smaller. That I think that there would be still, because it's so small, it would leave quite a bit of room, ironically, for human translated works of art. It would, because the narrative behind it would touch people. Narratives are incredibly important for humans in general. We're just driven by narratives. We both just now told stories about our connection to translation. That's how we communicate, and we deal with story. It's natural for us. It's the oral tradition is storytelling. That's how they remembered it, is through like hitting certain beats in a story. They could pass on those stories. Anyways, I think everybody understands that part, but it's just the story behind the human translation would be interesting to people. And I see this when I tell people about my work with Hannah Ahmed. They say, "Go, tell us more. Tell us more about her. Tell us more about your friendship." Is there any tension? Where's the conflict? There's a story behind it. It isn't just here's the information. And that's why we chose that title, Where Do You Live, is the title of our collaborative book, because it isn't supposed to be just, technically speaking, I live in the city of Salem, which is in Massachusetts, which is in the United States. That would be the book, if that was the answer to that question. But it's more than that. It's where do you live in your soul? Where do you live in your ideas? Do you live in the past? Which part of the past do you live? Do you live in war? Which war do you live in? In my case, I live in my father's war sometimes. That's not even my war. So there's all those things. There's so many layers that can be got to. And so even in the future, again, I'll just wrap it up. Even in the future, I think there'll be that niche, and people will be attracted to that storytelling, which will lend warmth to the experience of reading the translation that just an informational translation couldn't quite catch. I believe.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, because I'm wondering if you're saying something like this. One of the things that Sachs says is there's no question that technology can be incredibly accurate, and certainly as accurate as any human being in terms of the vocabulary, but that it lacks judgment, which sounds like a little bit of what you're talking about, to sort of take a word and know what the nuance is. I would think especially in poetry, but Marc, you can speak to fiction as well, but the judgment that it would take if you were translating from one language into another.
Yes, and the last thing I'll say about it is I have this book here into English, which was edited by Martha Collins, who I'd mentioned already, and Kevin Proofer, and it takes, there'll be one text that's translated 5 times, and they're next to each other. That fascinates me.
Yeah.
Like, why did this person choose this and this other person choose this? And then they all wrote essays about why they made their judgments.
Interesting.
That is fascinating, and that's different than, you could probably figure out from a machine too. You could see how is this machine programmed and to make these choices, but it just, that to me would hit a dead end at a certain, very soon. Even if you were to try to get into that narrative about the algorithm and how it's set up. Whereas with human beings, it's different, especially if you have a couple of human beings working on the same thing. What were the conversations like, and what was negotiated, and what was let go, and what was allowed, and all those different things.
Marc.
Yeah, I have 2 minds about this question, quite frankly. One is, I will say straight up front that the translation by my friend and teacher, Shani Suleiman Khalfan, of my book was beautiful. And I was lucky enough to be able to read it in translation and to be able to participate in the translation process. Shani and I would go back and forth, and she would say, well, this word, we don't have. So in one of my stories, one of the characters, his foot gets stomped on by a horse. And Shani said, we don't have horses in Zanzibar. It should be a donkey, right? And so when we translated that as donkey, and, and so, and so I will grant that Shani did a beautiful job translating my book. I also, and I think that there's been some experiences I know of in particular where the author has said that the book is maybe better in translation than it was in the original. I think it was Gabriel Garcia Marquez who said that 100 Years of Solitude, that was translated by Gregory Rabassa, was so beautifully done that he probably would not have won the Nobel Prize if it wasn't as good as it is, and
interesting.
And so, because the Nobel Prize Committee, certainly most of them read it in translation. They didn't read it in Spanish. There may have been 1 or 2 people who read it in the original Spanish. So that's one. So I acknowledge, and I am partly captivated by that viewpoint. On the other hand, I have to push back quite a bit, because I think that the idea that only humans can translate languages is a enormously privileged and European-centric view. it is a view that is self-serving to the translation community as well. You know, they say, well, we're so good at this, no machine is ever going to be as good as we are, you know, like, right? And that is, you know, I think about the song the American folk song John Henry, where, you know, he's a steel driving man until the machine comes along and can still drive better than him, you know, like, right? And, you know, he puts down his hammer, you know, because the machine is so much better. I mean, if we actually believed that machines didn't do certain things better than people did, we'd be digging wells with picks and shovels, you know, so that, you know, I feel like that is that historically is sort of belies our own experience. The other thing that it makes me aware of is that sure, there are a lot of people who are bilingual and who can translate between English and Spanish and French and, you know, and German and Spanish and, you know, and probably more and more between Hindi and English and, you know, like, and Chinese and English. But I think that we're doing ourselves and we're kidding ourselves if we think that's the whole world, because it's not. What that essentially says is it writes off every single African language from having a text translated into that language, and therefore enabling that language to live and making that work, whatever work that is, available to native speakers of that language. And I find that to be a very, very persuasive argument. I mean, I think that most Europeans don't realize, but African languages are big. You know, the largest community of African language speakers are Hausa are Nigerians, and they speak 82 million people speak Yoruba. And then the next largest is Swahili, and 79 million people speak Swahili in East Africa. And so unless we use something like machine translation, those people will be effectively disenfranchised, and they will be forced to use English. And that will effectively, within the next 2 or 3 generations, kill off those languages. Those languages will cease to exist, except as sort of commercial and familial ways of communicating. And so I'm enthusiastic. My sense is that machine translation is an approximation of, like all translations, machine translation is an approximation, and the machines, as we know, get better and better at translating. And I can vouch for that in Swahili. The Swahili translation that's now available on Google is far superior than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And I suspect that they will continue to get better. And so I have no reason to believe that they will not be as good as human translators, perhaps not for every text, but for the vast majority of texts. I'd like to propose, here's my Turing test of this, okay? We translate, we take a passage from a short story or a novel, and we translate it from, say, let's just make it simple. English into some other language, whatever language you would like to use. Doesn't necessarily have to be an African language, but you could use that. And we machine translate it, and we put it on the desk, and then we have 4 or 5 human translators also do a translation. And then we ask readers to tell us which one of those was translated by machine. If they are unable to do so, for whatever reason, then I suggest to you that machine translation, while not perfect, is close to human level translation. That's my sense of it.
Well, you've made a great case for AI, because we had talked earlier about how AI and other kinds of tech speed things up. And I was questioning at the time, what's the use of speed in what we're talking about? But you've made a great case for it, because speed will save languages. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Yes,
Yeah.
speed will save languages, absolutely. In the writ small, in terms of, okay, so you can listen to the news in, English. So for example, today, there was a newsworthy story reported on Al Jazeera, also now in the New York Times, about tax protesters being shot on the streets of Nairobi. And so that originally, probably, that report was probably generated, it was probably generated in English, but let's imagine that it was generated in Swahili. And with a speed translation, you would be able to listen to that report almost contemporaneously. And that's of some value to us, people who don't speak Swahili, who were able to, okay, we now understand what's going on, who's being arrested, who's being shot, who's doing the shooting, what's the basis here of the protest, etc.
Yes.
So
Well,
that's right.
Yeah, that goes to which text, because you mentioned that certain texts lend itself to this, certain situations, circumstances. I would say that probably poetry the least. That's my concern with.
But why?
I mean,
why do you think?
Because I think that the way that a work of art exists in the world, it's very connected to time, and certain things there's certain texts that have been translated over and over, and there's some people talk about, well, there's a privilege aspect to that. But I think a better way to look at it, like that's a little part. I don't think that's a primary part. I think that's just some part of it. A more primary way to look at it would be that the more text we get into the not the flow, but like, well, let me backtrack. So let's just say something like what's a famous translated poem? Well, I brought up in our email exchange Beowulf.
Beowulf, right?
Yeah, because I taught Beowulf when I was teaching college. So, and I looked through all the different translations, and what was the starkest to me was one of the first translations that treated it like a work of literature rather than a work of historical text, which was J.R.R. Tolkien. He did that, and I remember Tolkien, so I was really fascinated. Oh, Tolkien did this. And then I read what just came out at the time, which was by Seamus Heaney, who's a poet, and a poet with certain proclivities and just certain attachment to the tale. Like he explains in his intro that he had a certain artistic and like tribal aspect connection to the tale somehow, and he brought all that to bear, but especially his understanding of poetry, and he worked to maintain the poetic elements that were present in the original. So that took a really long time, and to translate those things, the sound, the other things that poetry brings, not just this is what it means, because that's what Tolkien did. Tolkien treated it like a work of art, but he still didn't get he wasn't a poet, so he didn't get the poetry aspects. And poetry is a very specific way of communicating, and so you have to you have to. I'm not saying AI could never do this. It could do it, and maybe it would have that thing where you put all the pieces of paper and people try to figure out what AI did it. I think that's still irrelevant, because the reason why Beowulf has lasted is it's going to be translated again and again. We're trying to get closer and closer and closer and closer to it. In fact, there was another like a feminist translation that didn't, the author's name didn't stick in my head because I think I wasn't into it. So I just left that. I wasn't as impressed with it. But I realized, of course, this is Beowulf. It means something to a certain part of the world, and it's going to last over time, because we keep returning to it, translating. And that's how I approached my and the anthology that I'm working with. At first I was thinking, I was focused on the fact I don't know Arabic. Now, how dare I, do this project at all? But then it struck me like, no, why not? All these women submitted, they're all alive and they voluntarily submitted their work. They wanted it published in English. And I see myself more as the first introduction. Like I'm just the person that says, hey, everybody speaking English and reading poetry, here are these women's work. You all can go and translate it too. Have fun with it. Like, let's keep this going. Like, pick your favorite one. And maybe you think you can do better with it, and maybe you can. And then, maybe it doesn't happen right away. Maybe the anthology exists for a while, but my hope is that these women's work will last through time. And there is that aspect of speed because it takes a long time to do this, but yeah.
So I don't want to be, I mean, I'm trying to take a sort of extreme position, just as a point of argument. I will say that I love my translation, and it's done entirely by a person, and with a collection of other people as well, I might add. So why wouldn't you? But I do want to push the argument a little bit, because I hear, why not have, you say that this is a first translation of these poems, right? So why not have a machine do that first translation? We hear a lot about, there's this other off the page contextual stuff that machines don't understand. Why not? Why don't they understand it? You can dump that information into chat GBT, and it'll crank out translation after translation.
Actually, I agree with that. That's true. Like, especially when you're mentioning the Thai languages, that scares me too. So I feel like, yes, why not? I don't think they're quite there yet though with when I think about poetry, because I've tried inputting some of the works that I worked on, some of those poems, into like Google Translate or one of the, maybe not Chat GPT, but one of the similar ones to that. I can't remember the name of it. And then I talked to the person I was working with, the co-translator, and we talked about why it wasn't correct. Actually, they kept telling me like, no, don't use this. But that was their judgment. That was part of the experience. And I decided, like, I'm not going to go with the machine thing in those instances. But I thought it was interesting. I did try it out, and I do think, for the sake of getting first translations, I think you're right. Like, we want, the world is going to leave people behind, and we don't. Why is that necessary when we have tech? So I do agree, but especially in utilitarian ways, definitely. With stories, and art and literature and those things, maybe we can have both existing. And as I said to start, human translation will probably become a niche that will still happen, but just be for people who like it. Like I buy vinyl records.
Yeah.
That's so unnecessary. Like, why do that? I have like everybody, I have a little computer here. I don't need it, but I like it. So it's just a niche.
Sure. I mean, and I listen, I don't want to come off as, like this breast pounding techno person, right? I think that's true. I do think, though, I'm very skeptical of the argument that, well, there's some off the page contexts that we all should be, if you're a sensitive translator, you would know, or you would think about, that sort of thing. And the reason I'm skeptical of that is that just sounds to me like a smoke and mirrors argument. It sounds to me like, okay, we're always told as writers, we're always told, look, when you read other writers' stuff, what you're reading is what's on the page. You should focus on what is on the page, and I mean, when I read, and this is not a terribly good example, when I read a Hemingway short story, I try to focus what's on the page. I don't think that the guy was a misogynist and a, an anti-Semite, and a horrible person. You can't dry clean Ernest Hemingway, like, right? But I think that, I try to say to myself, okay, look, that's not what he's writing about here. He's writing about this couple who's stuck in a hotel room, and there's a cat and they have to get some food, and how are they going to do that? Maybe their relationship is going to break up. So if I'm not thinking about the context, in
Yeah.
that way, And so I wonder whether we're asking machine translation to do something that we're trained actually not to do. We're trained not to. I mean, yes, of course, all of us, we bring to a work of art and literature our own cultural context. And and that's something machines do not do, at least until they're fed that cultural
Yeah.
context, right? Um, but I don't know, maybe that's not a bad thing. We're always bringing baggage to, the stories that we read. And, maybe it would be nice to show up with no baggage.
Well,
And
I agree.
you
Yeah,
know,
that would be interesting. I think that it would be like this book that I'm talking about.
yeah,
If there was a AI version,
yeah,
people could take that into consideration, because personally, I do think that that can go too far. I also try to not, when I'm in literature, if I'm sucked into it, then I'm sucked into it. I'm not thinking about everything else around it. Usually when I'm done though, I'll look it up. I'll look up all those things because I
mhm,
don't want to leave that world, and I want to know more about how the world was created. And I like that, but not when I'm in it. That's true. I
yeah,
think that that's interesting. Can I bring us to something you said earlier?
sure.
You were talking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and how his he felt like he won the award because the translation was so good. When I was, just a little backstory, just to preface my question. When I was in Lisbon, I met this very young Brazilian translator, Bruna Lobato, and she was telling me how she was taught. And I don't know how she thinks about it now, but at the time it struck me. She said she was taught that the translation is its own thing. Like
Hmm.
it's not. It is now has its own life. It's
Right.
like as if it was some one amorphous thing and it's separated off, and it related but not exactly the same. And in terms of art, it's its own artwork. And that also, when she told me that, that liberated me to feel like I could move in this world a little bit. And it sounds like Marquez thought that too.
I think he probably did. I mean, what I'm always amazed at. So there are authors. So let me try to think of one. So for example, modern American short story author George Saunders, who's one of my
Mhm.
favorite writers. His books are translated into many, many languages, some of which, he doesn't speak, and so he has to, when the translator and he are like zooming, like, right, he is totally in that person's hands. In other words, he cannot say to the translator, oh, it's Albanian. Well, I remember in Albanian, don't say it that way. We say it this way, like, right? Because
Yeah,
he doesn't know Albanian, and so it always makes me think about situations where authors really put themselves in the hands of the translator, sort of like, that game where somebody, you put a blindfold on and somebody
yep,
moves you around, like, right? And
yeah,
so I do think about that, and yeah, so I do wonder about that,
same. I really feel like there's a trust thing going on that I don't feel in other areas of my life, or in my relationships with other artists. Even I've collaborated with visual artists, and I didn't feel the same because we speak the same language, we can talk it out. But with this, I felt like, oh, these people are placing their trust in me. And then also vice versa, when I hand over my work, there's there's this big thing about trust, and it could go sideways, or if you're Marquez, you could get you
You
could
can
get
luck
them.
out, right? And yeah, really, you can do very well. I will say one of the things that's amazed me, one of my favorite writers is an Egyptian writer who also won the Nobel Prize, Mahfouz. And he was translated by actually Jacqueline Onassis when she worked at, I think she worked at Harper. She paid, the Harper paid for the translation of his work into English because otherwise it never would have gotten the renown that it has. And he probably would never have
Wow.
won the Nobel Prize. And it was translated by three people. Each of the books is translated by three people, and the books are massive, like, and when I read them in English, I was just like, how do you even begin to translate something like this? These are thousands of pages long, and I'm sure what you're going to say is like one word at a time, page by
Yeah.
page. That's how you do it, like, right. But just the daunting, amazing effort that goes into that, is just, sort of almost, I mean, it's jaw dropping. I'm just amazed at it. Totally.
Yeah, there's a time investment, so trust and time.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Can I just ask in a sort of, I mean, I tend to be kind of a both and person. Mark, when I was thinking about translating and human translating, I was thinking less about context than about something like, well, poetry, what Jen is that, and less whether, well, I've got three thoughts going at once at least, but less sort of whether a reader would be able to tell them apart, but whether the poet would be able to tell them apart. And on the other hand, what you say about making sure these languages don't get lost. I mean, it makes me think about Indigenous Americans and Canadians, where some of the languages are hanging on by a thread, some have disappeared. And if there was some way to use AI to sort of bring them back and make sure, without having to just give birth to a child so that you could speak to it, that would be intensely, amazingly important. So it's kind of like there's two, and they're not even competing, but they're kind of two different interests. And when you think about writing, you also think about, and I'm not a poet, so Jen, you can speak to this, but that each word matters. You really pick them. And so there's something to be said for a human being on the other side, and that you as author would know best. But I'm not going to know Swahili. I'm not going to know Arabic. I mean, so
I mean, I don't
there's a,
know
how do
whether,
you use the judgment to use both? I guess that's,
yeah, I mean, yes, I think that you do need to use judgment to use both. And I think, Jen and I have talked about starting out perhaps with a machine translation and moving up the functional scale to where, you get a human translation as sort of the ultimate, experience, especially in poetry. I'm always curious about poetry. My mother was a poet,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I was always amazed that she could do what she did. And I'm always staggered by poetry and poets, and how wonderfully direct they are, but I also wonder about why we always think that this is so precious. I mean, like, I mean, I don't know why it's so precious. I mean, my book starts with Lucille Clifton's poem.
oh,
Uh,
I love Lucille Clifton.
yeah, me too. Like, right. So let's see if I get to it here. Okay, so it starts out with blessing the boats,
Mhm.
and which is a beautiful poem, like, right.
Yeah.
And I wanted to use that poem, and it's as beautiful in Swahili as it is in English, like, I
Oh,
mean, and
nice.
so and to give you an example of approximations. I translated it first, and then my translator read my translation, and she said, "You must have been asleep when you did this, man. What, dude, what
Uh,
is wrong with you? You know, like really." And so she retranslated it so much better, you know. But I always wonder why we think poetry is so precious. I mean, and you know, it's
I
I just wonder, you know, I'm not being, I'm being a little bit of a jerk here, but you know, I'm not
no, there's
totally a jerk.
I actually no, I'm not. Poetry is not my church, so I'm okay about that. My teacher in grad school, Brenda Hillman, she used to talk about poetry being um, a trick in some ways, where you're balancing on sticks, spinning plates. So you'll start
Yeah,
with one, you'll spin the plate, you'll put
that's
one on
good.
your
I like that.
head, you have
Yeah,
one like coming off your shoulder, you have your elbow out, you have one in the like as you're just trying to spin as many plates as you can.
yeah,
That's really what's going on, and that's why it might feel precious, or it's tempting to be precious about it in translation, especially because you're still trying, or at least this is how I approach it. I'm still trying to make it sound like a poem. So a poem has musicality. I mean, even if it's a prose poem, so all the poems that I've been working with have all been in this modern uh, Arabic prose poetry. That's new to them. There, you know, none of it was the any of the classical forms. You know, so that made it easier for me in one way, but I didn't want to leave them so prosy. I just can't. I just felt like it wouldn't come across in English. It's not my sensibility, and I still brought some part of myself to it, which meant that I chose some words over, you know, other words. That's the judgment part, to retain musicality, and also juxtaposition of words. Like if there's a word that's similar to another word that's really close by, it does something with the mind. That's one of the plates you're spinning is psychology. You know how the
yeah,
brain works, like seeing two words nearby that are similar in conceptually, or they're similar connotatively, or you know on different levels they're similar. That's what poets are doing, and sometimes they don't know it, and then that those poets are doing great, but they don't know they're doing that. Other poets like me, I'm hyper aware of it, and that could that makes me take a long time to write my poems. Not so much with translation, because it's not, even though I agree that it my work that I'm working on is its own new artwork, I'm less attached to it, so I have a little more freedom and I can let it go a little sooner, but I'm still trying to balance all the plates. The first line has to be amazing, the end line has to be amazing. That's part of poetry. um so whatever I'm working with, I just work hard on those. I also think about line breaks, even if it's a prose poem. So in Arabic, they're not thinking about the line breaks really in their prose poetry, but I do, you know, because English readers are used to that in English. So I take some attention to
so do
that.
you think,
Yeah.
is there, do you think, Jen, are there things that can't be translated? That is, you know, are there things which there is no correspondence between one language to another, and so you can't, it's very difficult to
Def-
translate.
Definitely. I think I said this before. We're just getting closer and closer and closer, but we're not there. We're not identical.
Right,
Identical is the exact language. Like
right,
might as well speak it
right,
and
right,
just know that you don't understand it.
right,
That and that's the books I'm working on are all bilingual in that way. And in I'm setting up already events for these books, and they're all bilingual events,
right.
like as much as possible, bringing in an Arabic reader so that people can just hear the real poem and then what I tried to do with it and what I
Right.
made, you know, that mirrors it somewhat.
You know, the classic, there are a couple of classic cases in Swahili that are, there are no words, for example, there is no word to miss, the verb to miss, as in I miss you, right? You know, and so Swahili speakers adopt miss, an English word of miss, niku
Yes.
miss, which means you know, I miss you, you know, like, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, that's
which
interesting. Yeah.
which you know, like, and so in one of my stories, I have one of the characters say to a Swahili speaker, this person is a English speaker, he says, why is there no word for miss? And the Swahili speaker says, well, if you don't have a word for miss, maybe you don't miss. Maybe like there's no feeling of missing if you don't have a word to like,
Oh,
hook it,
wow.
hook it onto, like, right. There are other Swahili words that don't have an easy English translation. I'm going to use a simple one. So, wowowo. Wowowo means a woman with large breasts.
Okay.
And so if you think about whoa, 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 it has two, like a bunch of
Yeah.
W's, which are ideographic to big boobs, like, right. And so, the first time someone explained that to me, I just fell on the floor, like, right. And how could that possibly be, like, right. So, but there are certain things I think that in all languages, that are difficult to translate. I know that's true. Yes, I think that is true. So
Well, about that one thing, I have a rule in my own mind about that kind of thing, which is I let the language be strange.
yeah,
So and with poetry, it's so much easier because
yeah,
that's a plate that's the time when you can spin that plate is in a poem where you probably can't do that in other places where it's just like, what is this person doing? I'm trying to get this information, or I'm trying to understand what's going on here. Instead, in a poem, it's like, it's a little strange. I think also I'm careful though. I make sure that it's not all strange because that would be alienating for an English reader, in my opinion, for an English reader. Maybe not, but that's just what I think. But I have some places where if I pressed on it, I asked questions. And then also if it sounds kind of intriguing how it is, then I just leave it. So Hannah, she has this line, death is to expect death, which I guess it was hard for me to get that. And I've told that to other people and they're like, yeah, I get it.
wow.
But for me, I was like, can I change it? She's like, no, you can't, because that's how you say it. There's these words and that is the saying. And so the negotiation was also done on that line. And so I left it and I just decided, you know what, for me, that's going to be strange. And then, as I said, I found out for other people, death is to expect death. Made sense immediately. Mm-hmm. It kind of spins me a little bit. It's strange. That's just one thing that comes to my mind. There were other places, other lines that were also just strange.
That's a great line. I love that line. That's beautiful.
It is, and it's an end line too. So that also kind of convinced me because it ends on that. A poem about her experiences in war, and
Great.
her family and things like that. So that's also, I mean, that goes back to poetry. Is it precious or not? Because I think that it's good to not let it be precious, because then you can let things be strange. If it's so like, oh, you try to control it too much. You try to get it right too much. And then it could decimate the artwork that you're creating as a translator.
So I have a feeling this could go on and it would be wonderful, but I'm going to stop at letting things be strange because I like that line very much. And because it's almost 8:30. So I don't know if there's anything either of you wants to say to kind of wrap up. I think this has been fantastic. I think there's many, many more things that people could say about it. But is there anything each of you would like to say to just kind of wrap up?
Jennifer, I just want to say, and Margery, how much I enjoyed doing this. This was a very interesting conversation for me. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yes, I really enjoyed talking to you, Marc. It was wonderful. The last thing that I'll add for everyone is, if you've never done translation, don't be afraid to try something, to try it, especially with languages that are losing prominence in the world, or just have none barely, and be part of that movement of bringing them back. I think that'd be great.
It's a great idea. Yeah, I like that point a lot, Marc. That really makes sense. So I want to thank you both. I didn't have anything to do and except listen and learn and think about the difference between poetry and fiction, and imagine trying to turn great expectations into a poem. And I couldn't get there, let alone in Swahili. So, but thank you, and I appreciate you both. And Mark, you also get extra thanks for being the tech maven tonight. Mark is on the board of the Writers' Room and one of our technical geniuses. So I think there's going to be a kind of break in the summer, both for the readings from the room and the interview series, but we will be back in the fall. And you can check out, we'll certainly post things on Instagram and Facebook and on the website. So keep your eyes open, keep your eyes peeled for that. And yeah, again, if you're curious at all, please check out the website. And otherwise, thank you for joining us, and good night, everybody.
Thanks, Marjorie. Good night.
Thank you. Good
Good
night.
night.